Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart is a landmark book that immediately thrust the whole African continent onto the international literary dialogue. Achebe used local forms of rhythm and narrative to capture the zeitgeist of a place completely unfamiliar to English literature, and provided perspective of West African life only known through anachronistic colonialist texts. A few years after Things Fall Apart, he infamously rebuked Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness for its alleged racist overtones, but he had a point in that there were few who actually had psychological insight into daily African life. And such is the beauty and the legacy of this novel. Set in Africa in the late 19th century, Achebe details the life of Okonkwo, an Igbo clansman in what is now modern-day Nigeria. His past and his failures are explored with precision, and as he tries to take on a more important role in society, he begins to feel the push of his own shame creeping up on him. There is a painful tension that racks this novel. Achebe makes it clear from the beginning that failure for Okonkwo is inevitable, and as he tries to administer justice upon the local Umuofia people, he ends up accidentally killing a 16-year-old boy. Suddenly, he must exile himself to uphold the principles he tries so hard to maintain. Eventually, though, he realizes that missionaries are too great a threat for him to ignore, and he collects his pride and decides to rebel. This will spark a violent conflict with the church that will bring him closer to perdition. Some who read Things Fall Apart may only see the simplicity of his style and conclude that his prose is not dynamic, but critics have recognized just how deeply his linguistic innovations go. Not only does his English get influenced by the Igbo language, but it is completely modified to conform to his linguistic structure in great detail. Just as many novels in the 60s and 70s will use magic realism to create fuller depictions of local mythologies, Achebe will defy the conventions of the West to create a unique type of novel. That's not to say that Achebe doesn't integrate Western storytelling techniques. The novel is as inevitably tragic as any Shakespearean tragedy, but the reader gets to see just how Okonkwo's internalized fears manifest into brutal physical repercussions. Things Fall Apart integrates a lot of local lore and culture as well, and while it may come off as a quasi-anthropological work to some, the descriptions of Igbo lifestyle serve more as a reader's guide to the literary qualities of the local language and culture. The descriptive aspect of this book acts as symbolically harmonized in contrast with the colonizing British, who destroy their culture through false pretenses of tyrannical missionary work. The title of the novel, which makes reference to W.B. Yeats' famous Second Coming poem, is of course a comment to the destruction of a civilization. I would also argue, though, that it's a reference to Achebe's use of the English language. English, at least in this book, is a proclamation of power, and it is weaponized by the missionaries. Achebe is trying to repel that with this novel. Yeats' poem arguably foreshadowed the deliberate collapsing of the language by modernist writers. Achebe, though, wishes also to break it down and build it back up again. The language he uses is governed, so to speak, by the cultural norms of the Igbo people. There is, for example, much emphasis placed on gender, as manliness and femininity are always used to identify people. There is a whole new symbolic framework as well. To use an example, the natural world is much less separate from Igbo civilization, and it represents less of an escape and more of a repository of both good and bad omens. Along with being a hugely groundbreaking work and one of the first internationally known African novels, Things Fall Apart used the language of oppression as a tool to rebel against those past oppressing forces. Some raise their eyebrows at the idea of literature bringing change, but this did more than just question the brutality of colonialism. It shows just how some can fight it, even if the imposing Western conventions brought Achebe's hero closer to his inevitable ruin.